The success of Messalina's public competitions revealed possibilities that extended far beyond personal sexual satisfaction into realms of political control that would transform her from scandalous empress into genuine threat to imperial security. By 42 CE, she had recognized that the same psychological techniques that allowed her to dominate professional prostitutes could be systematically applied to control Rome's political and military leadership through carefully orchestrated sexual blackmail operations. The establishment of her criminal enterprise represented a masterpiece of organizational planning that demonstrated intelligence and strategic thinking worthy of military commanders. Rather than operating from obvious locations that might attract official attention, Messalina created her headquarters within a luxurious villa near the Campus Martius that appeared to be nothing more than an exclusive social club for Rome's cultural elite. The property's legitimate facade allowed her to host gatherings that attracted the city's most powerful individuals while concealing activities that would have resulted in immediate execution if discovered. Her recruitment methods revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that made resistance nearly impossible for targeted victims. Messalina used her imperial authority to identify aristocratic women whose families faced financial difficulties, political persecution, or social disgrace that threatened their survival within Rome's competitive hierarchy. These women, desperate to protect their positions and loved ones, found themselves gradually drawn into activities that began as innocent social obligations but evolved into systematic sexual exploitation. The genius of Messalina's operation lay in its incremental nature. New recruits weren't immediately informed about the true purpose of their involvement, but rather introduced to increasingly intimate activities disguised as authentic ancient religious practices or sophisticated cultural entertainments. By the time participants realized the true nature of their situation, they were already too compromised to object without destroying their own reputations and family standing. Client selection represented the most calculating aspect of Messalina's criminal enterprise. Rather than serving random wealthy Romans who could afford expensive entertainment, she deliberately targeted senators, military commanders, and provincial governors whose positions gave them access to information valuable for imperial interests. Every encounter was carefully documented by hidden servants who recorded conversations, identified personal weaknesses, and gathered intelligence that could later be used for political manipulation. The scope of information Messalina accumulated through her operation was staggering in its implications for imperial governance. She knew which senators were planning opposition to imperial policies, which military commanders harbored treasonous thoughts, and which provincial administrators were corrupt or disloyal. This intelligence network made her one of the most informed individuals in the Roman Empire, possessing secrets that could destroy careers, end lives, or reshape imperial policy according to her personal desires. Her blackmail techniques were psychologically devastating and virtually impossible to resist once victims had been compromised. The mere threat of revealing that prominent Romans had unknowingly engaged in sexual activities with their emperor's wife was enough to ensure absolute compliance with any demands she might make. But Messalina's methods went far beyond simple exposure, incorporating layers of shame and complicity that made resistance psychologically impossible. The most insidious aspect of her operation was how it corrupted the fundamental relationships that held Roman society together. She forced aristocratic women to betray their class loyalties, coerced political leaders to act against their principles, and transformed sacred bonds of marriage and family into tools of manipulation and control. The very foundations of Roman civilization, honor, loyalty, and virtue, became weapons in her arsenal of psychological warfare. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries began reporting strange irregularities in Roman policy decisions that seemed to favor specific individuals without logical explanation. Military appointments went to candidates whose qualifications were questionable but who somehow possessed the Empress's support. Trade agreements benefited merchants who had no apparent connection to imperial interests but whose loyalty Messalina had secured through her establishment services. The empire's decision-making process had been quietly subverted by what appeared to be a high-end brothel but was actually an intelligence operation that gave its operator unprecedented influence over imperial governance. Messalina had essentially created a shadow government that operated through sexual blackmail rather than traditional political authority, making her the real power behind Claudius's throne. Palace officials who remained loyal to legitimate imperial authority began noticing subtle changes in the emperor's policies that reflected knowledge and priorities that seemed inconsistent with his usual decision-making patterns. Claudius, unaware of his wife's activities, found himself implementing policies that had been influenced by information gathered through sexual exploitation of his own political allies. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound and lasting. Trust between political allies eroded as individuals wondered who else had been compromised by the Empress's operation. Marriage relationships suffered as husbands and wives questioned each other's loyalty and activities. The bonds of honor and mutual respect that had enabled Roman expansion and governance for centuries were systematically destroyed by one woman's appetite for power and control. Most disturbing was how Messalina's success demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful governmental systems to systematic sexual corruption. Her operation proved that no amount of military strength, political tradition, or cultural sophistication could protect a civilization from leaders willing to exploit the most intimate aspects of human nature for personal advantage. By 44 C, Messalina's criminal empire had grown beyond anything that could be concealed indefinitely. Too many people knew too much, and the psychological pressure on her victims was creating instabilities that threatened to expose the entire operation. But rather than recognizing the danger and retreating to safer activities, the Empress, who had already corrupted an empire, decided that operating in secret was no longer exciting enough to satisfy her expanding appetites for power and degradation. The next phase of her descent would abandon all pretense of secrecy and plunge Rome into the most shocking public spectacles in its history. By 44 CE, the psychological satisfaction Messalina derived from secret operations had been diminished by familiarity, driving her to seek new forms of stimulation that would recreate the intense emotions she had experienced during her initial transgressions. The Empress, who had once thrilled at the danger of anonymous brothel visits, now craved public recognition of her sexual dominance, leading to the organization of elaborate spectacles that served as both entertainment and political theater designed to cement her control over Rome's elite. These events represented the culmination of Messalina's understanding that sexual humiliation was more effective than military force for controlling human behavior. Rather than relying on traditional forms of imperial authority that might provoke organized resistance, she created situations where opposition required victims to admit their own participation in activities that violated every principle of Roman morality and social order. The transformation of legitimate religious festivals into vehicles for systematic sexual degradation revealed Messalina's genius for psychological manipulation. She would begin by issuing imperial invitations to ceremonies honoring various gods and goddesses, requiring attendance from senators, their wives, and other high-ranking officials under the pretext of fulfilling civic and religious duties that no loyal Roman could refuse without appearing treasonous. What began as formal religious observances would gradually transform through carefully orchestrated stages into scenes of systematic humiliation that left participants too compromised to later oppose her authority. Messalina had developed techniques for escalating these gatherings from dignified ceremonies into something far more sinister, using the gradual nature of the transformation to prevent anyone from identifying a specific moment when they could have legitimately objected. The festivals typically began with traditional Roman religious practices that emphasized the connection between imperial authority and divine favor. Participants would offer prayers for the empire's prosperity, perform ancient rituals that honored Rome's protective deities, and participate in ceremonies that reinforced their loyalty to imperial governance. These opening activities created an atmosphere of legitimate religious devotion that made later objections appear sacrilegious. As the ceremonies progressed, Messalina would introduce increasingly intimate elements claimed to be authentic ancient practices that had been rediscovered through scholarly research. She possessed sufficient education and intellectual authority to make these claims convincing, particularly when supported by carefully prepared documentation that appeared to validate her historical assertions about forgotten religious traditions. The psychological manipulation reached its peak as Messalina forced political rivals to perform with each other while she provided commentary and instruction. Senators who had opposed imperial policies found themselves naked and degraded before their colleagues, their dignity destroyed and their authority permanently compromised through participation in activities that would follow them for the remainder of their careers. Her techniques for managing these events demonstrated sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social dynamics. She understood that forcing aristocratic men and women to degrade themselves publicly created bonds of shared shame that prevented participants from later opposing her authority. Everyone who remained through the complete ceremonies became complicit in maintaining the fiction that these gatherings were legitimate religious observances rather than imperial sex parties. The most horrifying aspect of these public spectacles was how Messalina began incorporating younger participants into the activities. Palace records suggest she recruited adolescent sons and daughters of prominent families, claiming their participation was necessary for religious authenticity and threatening family destruction for anyone who refused to allow their children's involvement. These young people, raised to obey imperial authority without question, became unwilling participants in their own exploitation. The Empress had created a system where protecting children required parents to admit their own participation in activities that would destroy entire family lines. Political opposition became impossible without confessing complicity in the systematic corruption of Rome's next generation. Foreign observers stationed in Rome began reporting strange behavioral changes among Roman officials during diplomatic negotiations. Previously confident senators seemed nervous and submissive when discussing imperial policies. Military commanders appeared distracted and fearful during strategic planning sessions. The empire's leadership had been psychologically broken by an empress who understood that sexual shame was more powerful than military conquest for controlling human behavior. The economic implications were equally disturbing as Messalina's festivals required enormous resources that were diverted from legitimate imperial functions. The cost of venues, entertainment, food, and elaborate decorations meant that Roman citizens were essentially funding their own government's corruption through taxes that supported these disguised orgies rather than infrastructure, military preparedness, or provincial administration. Perhaps most significantly, these public spectacles marked the point where Messalina's activities transitioned from personal scandal into systematic destruction of Roman governmental effectiveness. The psychological damage inflicted on the empire's leadership created decision-making paralysis that affected everything from military strategy to economic policy, demonstrating how individual moral corruption could cascade into civilizational decline. The Empress, who had begun her descent seeking personal thrills, had evolved into an existential threat to the survival of the Roman Empire itself. Her appetite for public degradation had grown beyond anything that could be satisfied through traditional means, setting the stage for the final transgression that would force even her most compromised allies to acknowledge that Messalina had moved beyond scandal into open rebellion against imperial authority. In 48 CE, while Emperor Claudius was absent from Rome overseeing critical grain shipments in Ostia that would prevent famine throughout the empire, Messalina committed an act so unprecedented that it shocked even Romans who had become accustomed to her systematic destruction of traditional morality. She held a full legal wedding ceremony with Gaius Silius, a handsome young senator she had been pursuing for months, essentially declaring herself divorced from the emperor while simultaneously maintaining her imperial title and authority. This wasn't a symbolic ritual or private ceremony that could be dismissed as another of her sexual adventures, but a legally binding Roman marriage complete with religious observances, official witnesses, and formal contracts that transferred property and established inheritance rights. Messalina had essentially created a constitutional crisis that challenged fundamental principles of imperial governance while Emperor Claudius remained unaware of the revolutionary acts being performed in his name. The psychological motivations behind this ultimate transgression revealed the extent to which Messalina's appetite for power and scandal had evolved beyond anything that could be satisfied through conventional means. Her previous activities, no matter how shocking, had ultimately been private affairs that could be concealed or denied if necessary. This public marriage represented a complete abandonment of pretense and a direct challenge to imperial authority that made civil war a genuine possibility. Gaius Silius, initially flattered by the empress's attention and seduced by promises of wealth and advancement, found himself trapped in a nightmare that exceeded anything he could have anticipated when their relationship began. What had appeared to be a powerful alliance with Rome's most influential woman had transformed into participation in treason that would result in death regardless of the ultimate outcome. Contemporary accounts suggest that Silius began planning escape routes as he realized the full implications of his situation, but Messalina's psychological hold over him had become too complete for resistance. She had created emotional and financial dependencies that made withdrawal impossible, while simultaneously threatening destruction for any betrayal of their relationship. The wedding celebration itself became a multi-day orgy that included most of Rome's remaining uncorrupted aristocracy, forcing even Messalina's most compromised allies to acknowledge that she had crossed into open rebellion against imperial authority. The festivities served as both celebration of her new marriage and demonstration of her power over Roman society's leadership, many of whom attended despite understanding the treasonous implications of their participation. Messalina's psychological state during this period suggests complete disconnection from reality and an inability to distinguish between her fantasies of absolute power and the practical limitations imposed by Roman law and military authority. She began referring to Silius as emperor and herself as his empress, apparently believing she could simply replace Claudius through force of will and the compliance of her blackmail victims. The logistics of organizing such an elaborate public ceremony while maintaining official secrecy from the emperor revealed the extent of Messalina's network within imperial administration. Palace officials, religious authorities, and legal administrators who should have been loyal to Claudius instead facilitated activities that constituted open treason, demonstrating how completely she had corrupted normal governmental functions. Most disturbingly, Messalina began issuing orders in Silius's name and planning a formal coronation ceremony that would legitimize their rule over the Roman Empire. She had apparently convinced herself that sexual control over Rome's leadership translated into actual political authority that could replace legitimate imperial succession through popular or military support. The constitutional implications were staggering as Roman law recognized her new marriage as legitimate while she simultaneously remained Claudius's wife, creating legal paradoxes that had no precedent in imperial history. The empire essentially had two emperors and two empresses, with governmental authority divided between legitimate imperial administration and Messalina's revolutionary alternative. Meanwhile, Claudius remained focused on essential administrative duties that kept the empire functioning, unaware that his wife had essentially declared war against his authority and was planning his replacement with a lover barely old enough to hold senatorial office. The contrast between his dutiful attention to imperial responsibilities and her complete abandonment of loyalty revealed how thoroughly their marriage had become a facade concealing irreconcilable conflicts. The confrontation became inevitable when loyal freedmen risked their lives to inform Claudius of the crisis threatening his reign. These brave individuals, understanding that reporting Messalina's treason might result in their own deaths if she retained power, chose loyalty to legitimate imperial authority over personal safety. Claudius's initial reaction was disbelief that even Messalina could commit acts so openly treasonous. But as evidence mounted, he realized he faced not just personal betrayal but potential civil war that could destroy the empire he had devoted his life to serving. The systematic erasure of Messalina's memory from official Roman records meant that her story survived primarily through whispered accounts and private writings that documented one of history's most disturbing examples of how personal corruption can cascade into civilizational crisis. Modern analysis of her reign reveals psychological and political patterns that continue to threaten governmental stability across cultures and centuries. The most significant lesson from Messalina's destruction of Roman imperial authority lies in understanding how sexual blackmail can systematically corrupt decision-making processes within even the most sophisticated governmental systems. Her technique of using compromising information to control political leaders created a shadow authority structure that operated independently of legitimate institutional channels, demonstrating how individual moral failures can metastasize into systematic governance breakdown. Contemporary historians struggle to comprehend the psychological dynamics that drove an empress who possessed unlimited luxury, security, and social status to seek satisfaction through activities that threatened everything she had been given. Messalina's behavior suggests personality disorders that made conventional sources of power and pleasure inadequate, requiring increasingly extreme stimulation that ultimately became incompatible with civilized society. The speed with which Roman governmental effectiveness collapsed under her influence reveals the vulnerability of complex political systems to leaders who prioritize personal gratification over institutional preservation. Within less than a decade, the empire that had conquered the known world found itself governed by officials whose primary loyalty was to an empress who threatened them with sexual exposure rather than to the emperor they had sworn to serve. Perhaps most disturbing was how Messalina's corruption infected the next generation through her systematic exploitation of aristocratic children who were forced to participate in activities that would shape their understanding of power, sexuality, and governmental authority for their entire lives. The psychological damage inflicted on Rome's future leadership class created long-term consequences that extended far beyond her individual reign. The constitutional implications of her bigamous marriage demonstrated how sexual rebellion could evolve into political revolution that challenged fundamental principles of imperial succession and governmental legitimacy. Her attempt to replace Claudius with Silius represented not just personal betrayal but systematic destruction of the legal foundations that enabled Roman civilization to function across vast territories and diverse populations. Modern democracies face similar vulnerabilities when leaders prioritize personal interests over institutional preservation, using their authority to corrupt rather than strengthen the systems they have been entrusted to govern. Messalina's example warns that no governmental structure is strong enough to survive leaders who view their positions as opportunities for personal exploitation rather than public service. The ultimate lesson from Rome's darkest imperial hour may be that civilizations are only as strong as the character of their individual leaders, and that no amount of military power, economic prosperity, or cultural sophistication can protect societies from those who would sacrifice collective welfare for personal satisfaction. Messalina's story serves as a permanent warning about the consequences of allowing power to concentrate in individuals whose psychological makeup makes them fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of leadership in civilized society. The marble corridors of the Palatine Palace echoed with whispered conversations that would have horrified the citizens of Rome had they known what their empress was planning behind closed doors. While Emperor Claudius struggled with the administrative burdens of governing the known world, his young wife Valeria Messalina was conducting her own form of empire building, one that would transform her from Rome's most promising empress into its most dangerous predator. Born into the ancient patrician family of the Statilii in 17 CE, Messalina represented everything Romans believed an imperial woman should embody. Her bloodline traced back to the earliest days of the Republic, connecting her to legendary figures who had shaped Roman destiny through military conquest and political wisdom. When she married Claudius in 38 CE at barely 15 years old, Roman society celebrated the union as a perfect alignment of noble heritage and imperial power. Contemporary sources describe her as possessing the classical beauty that defined aristocratic breeding, pale skin that never saw manual labor, golden hair arranged in elaborate styles that required hours of slave attendance, and delicate features that spoke of generations of careful genetic selection. She moved through state ceremonies with the grace expected of someone raised from birth to occupy the highest levels of Roman society, her every gesture calculated to project the dignity that Romans demanded from their imperial family. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, something far more complex and dangerous was developing. Modern psychological analysis suggests that Messalina's extreme behaviors reflected a personality type that craved not just attention, but the specific thrill that came from secret transgression. The greater the contrast between her public dignity and private activities, the more intense her psychological satisfaction became. The imperial palace itself contributed to her psychological development in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Living within the Palatine complex meant existing in a world where every moment was choreographed, every conversation monitored, and every decision filtered through layers of protocol that removed any sense of authentic personal experience. For a young woman with an already complex relationship to power and sexuality, this environment became a psychological pressure cooker that would eventually explode in the most spectacular fashion. Roman society's rigid gender expectations created additional psychological pressure that may have contributed to Messalina's eventual breakdown. Aristocratic women were expected to embody virtues that essentially denied their humanity, perfect chastity, selfless devotion to family, and complete submission to male authority. Any deviation from these impossible standards could result in social destruction or even death. The psychological toll of maintaining such artificial perfection while possessing a naturally rebellious personality created internal conflicts that demanded increasingly extreme outlets. Palace servants began noticing subtle changes in Messalina's behavior during her second year as Empress. She would dismiss her attendants at unusual hours, claiming fatigue, then remain awake for mysterious private activities. Her requests for clothing became strange, simple garments that could disguise her aristocratic status rather than the elaborate costumes expected of imperial appearances. Most tellingly, she began asking detailed questions about how ordinary Roman women lived, worked, and entertained themselves. These seemingly innocent curiosities were actually systematic research into a world that fascinated and attracted her precisely because it represented everything her position forbade. The empress who could command legions and allocate imperial resources was powerless to experience authentic human connection or genuine physical pleasure within the constraints of her official role. The psychological appeal of anonymous encounters with strangers who saw her as just another woman, rather than an untouchable imperial figure, became an obsession that would ultimately consume her. Her transformation from dutiful empress to sexual predator didn't happen overnight, but rather through a calculated process of boundary testing that revealed the calculating intelligence behind her apparent madness. Each transgression was carefully planned to avoid detection while maximizing the psychological thrill of successfully deceiving the most powerful surveillance apparatus in the ancient world. She was essentially conducting a personal war against the imperial system that had given her everything except the ability to be authentically human. The most disturbing aspect of this early period was how Messalina began viewing other people as objects for her experimentation rather than individuals deserving respect or consideration. Palace records suggest she started manipulating servants and minor officials into compromising situations, then observing their reactions with the detached curiosity of someone studying insects. This objectification of others would become the foundation for the systematic exploitation that characterized her later criminal enterprises. By 40 CE, Messalina had completed her psychological transformation from conflicted young woman into something far more dangerous, a predator who understood that her imperial status made her essentially untouchable regardless of her behavior. The empress who smiled graciously during religious ceremonies was secretly planning nocturnal adventures that would make her the most feared woman in the Roman Empire. The festival of Saturnalia in December 40 CE provided Messalina with the perfect opportunity to transform her psychological fantasies into physical reality. During this annual celebration, traditional social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, slaves could mock their masters, and normal moral restrictions relaxed throughout the empire. For an empress seeking to explore forbidden territories, these few days of sanctioned chaos offered ideal camouflage for activities that would have been immediately detected during normal periods. Messalina's first expedition into Rome's underworld required months of careful preparation that demonstrated the methodical intelligence behind her apparent recklessness. She had spent weeks studying the routines of palace guards, identifying windows of opportunity when she could disappear without triggering security protocols. Her network of trusted servants, carefully selected for their absolute loyalty and discretion, had been gradually expanded to include individuals capable of providing disguises, transportation, and most crucially, plausible explanations for her absence should questions arise. The Subura district, Rome's most notorious entertainment quarter, operated according to rules that existed nowhere else in the civilized world. Here, aristocratic women seeking adventure mingled with professional entertainers, wealthy merchants purchased experiences unavailable in respectable society, and social boundaries dissolved in ways that would have horrified conservative Romans. For Messalina, entering this world represented not just sexual experimentation, but a complete rejection of everything her imperial position demanded. Her first encounter with professional prostitution revealed psychological dimensions that neither she nor her eventual victims could have anticipated. Rather than being satisfied with simple rebellion against imperial constraints, Messalina discovered that her aristocratic background created unique advantages in this new environment. Her education, refinement, and natural intelligence allowed her to understand and manipulate clients in ways that professional prostitutes, despite their experience, could not match. The brothel keeper who unknowingly accepted Rome's Empress as a temporary worker later described the experience to palace investigators as unlike anything in his decades of managing sexual entertainment. This mysterious aristocratic woman displayed an appetite and endurance that exceeded his most experienced professionals, but more disturbing was her apparent need to prove superiority over everyone around her. She wasn't seeking money or even pleasure in any conventional sense, but rather validation of her ability to excel in an arena where imperial status provided no advantages. Contemporary accounts suggest that Messalina's performance that first night went far beyond anything the establishment had witnessed. She serviced more clients than workers who had been practicing their profession for years, displaying a combination of technique and intensity that shocked even individuals accustomed to extreme sexual demands. But perhaps most revealing was her reaction when dawn approached and normal operations ceased for the day. While other women gratefully accepted rest after their labors, Messalina demanded more clients, more challenges, more opportunities to demonstrate that an empress could outperform any common prostitute. Her competitive drive had found an outlet that provided psychological satisfaction impossible to achieve through traditional imperial activities. She had discovered a realm where victory was measured in purely physical terms, free from the political calculations that dominated every other aspect of her existence. The psychological implications of this first transgression established patterns that would characterize all of Messalina's subsequent behavior. She had learned that sexual degradation, rather than diminishing her sense of power, actually enhanced it by proving her ability to succeed in any environment regardless of social expectations. The greater the contrast between her public dignity and private activities, the more intense her satisfaction became. More disturbing was how this initial experience revealed Messalina's capacity for compartmentalization that allowed her to maintain perfect imperial composure while planning increasingly elaborate forms of sexual transgression. Palace observers noted no changes in her public behavior following her first brothel visit. She continued hosting state dinners, attending religious ceremonies, and fulfilling her role as Claudius's devoted wife with the same grace and dignity that had always characterized her public appearances. This ability to maintain separate identities, dutiful empress by day, competitive prostitute by night, demonstrated psychological sophistication that made her infinitely more dangerous than someone whose behavior was simply impulsive or uncontrolled. Messalina was conducting systematic experiments in power and degradation, carefully documenting what worked and what didn't, always planning the next escalation in her personal war against imperial constraints. Within weeks of her first brothel experience, she had established regular patterns of nocturnal activity that transformed her occasional rebellion into systematic criminal behavior. The empress who had once satisfied herself with imagining forbidden pleasures was now actively competing with professional prostitutes for clients, using techniques and resources that no ordinary woman could match. Her descent had begun, but what seemed like simple sexual rebellion was actually the foundation for a criminal empire that would eventually threaten the stability of Rome itself. By early 41 CE, Messalina's nocturnal activities had evolved from secretive rebellion into organized competition that attracted audiences of wealthy Romans seeking entertainment more shocking than anything available in conventional venues. Word of the mysterious aristocratic woman who could outperform professional prostitutes had spread through Rome's underground networks, creating demand for increasingly elaborate spectacles that would satisfy the jaded appetites of imperial society's most corrupted members. The challenge that would define Messalina's reputation occurred during the spring celebrations honoring Venus, when she openly challenged Scylla, Rome's most celebrated and expensive courtesan, to an endurance competition that became legendary even among Romans accustomed to extreme entertainment. The contest rules were deliberately simple: Whoever could service the most clients between sunset and dawn would claim victory, and an enormous prize purse contributed by spectators betting on the outcome. Scylla represented everything that professional sexual entertainment could achieve in the ancient world. She had been trained from childhood in techniques passed down through generations of courtesans, possessed natural beauty enhanced by cosmetics and fashion that cost more than most Romans earned in years, and had built a reputation based on consistently satisfying the most demanding and wealthy clients in the empire. Her participation in this contest legitimized what might otherwise have been dismissed as aristocratic experimentation. The venue chosen for their competition revealed how completely Messalina had corrupted Rome's social elite. Rather than some hidden brothel or private residence, the contest took place in a luxurious villa owned by a former consul who had been gradually drawn into Messalina's web of sexual and political manipulation. Senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants gathered to witness their empress compete like a gladiator in an arena of flesh, placing enormous bets while maintaining the fiction that they were attending a private cultural celebration. As the competition began, Scylla's professionalism became immediately apparent. She had developed strategies for managing clients efficiently while conserving energy for the long ordeal ahead, pacing herself carefully and using psychological techniques that maximized satisfaction while minimizing physical strain. Her approach reflected years of experience in managing sexual endurance competitions that were common entertainment in Rome's pleasure districts. Messalina's strategy revealed the calculating intelligence that made her infinitely more dangerous than any ordinary competitor. Rather than relying purely on physical endurance, she used her aristocratic education and natural charisma to create emotional connections with clients that transcended simple physical satisfaction. Each encounter became a performance that combined sexual technique with psychological manipulation, creating experiences that clients would remember and discuss long after the competition ended. By midnight, Scylla had serviced 15 clients and was beginning to show signs of fatigue despite her professional training. The audience, initially skeptical that any aristocratic woman could compete with Rome's premier courtesan, began recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Messalina not only matched Scylla's pace but appeared to be gaining energy rather than losing it as the night progressed. The psychological dynamics of the competition revealed disturbing aspects of Messalina's character that went far beyond simple sexual appetite. She seemed to derive particular satisfaction from humiliating a professional whose reputation and livelihood depended on sexual superiority. Each client she serviced represented not just personal pleasure but a victory over someone who represented everything Messalina's imperial position prevented her from becoming. As dawn approached, Scylla had reached her absolute limit after servicing 25 clients. Despite her professional pride and the enormous stakes involved, she was forced to concede defeat and withdraw from the competition. The audience expected Messalina to claim victory and end the spectacle, but what happened next revealed the true depths of her obsession. Rather than accepting her triumph over Rome's premier courtesan, Messalina continued accepting new clients throughout the morning hours, driven by compulsions that transcended any rational explanation. Historical accounts suggest she ultimately serviced over 30 men that day, stopping only when no additional volunteers could be found among the increasingly horrified spectators. Her victory wasn't celebrated but witnessed in stunned silence by Romans who realized they had observed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial dignity and aristocratic behavior. The Empress, who should have embodied Rome's highest values, had chosen degradation as entertainment, proving her superiority through activities that would have destroyed any ordinary woman's reputation and social standing. The psychological implications were staggering. This wasn't desperate behavior driven by poverty or coercion, but calculated choices made by the most powerful woman in the civilized world. Messalina had discovered that her imperial status made debasement more thrilling rather than less, creating psychological satisfaction that no conventional imperial activity could provide. More ominously, this public competition had demonstrated to Rome's elite that their empress was capable of anything, bound by no moral constraints that might limit her future behavior.